I froze when I saw my wife offer her neck so her boss could smell her perfume during the company dinner. There was no hesitation in the gesture, no discomfort. Just a natural, intimate movement, as if that kind of closeness was already a habit between the two. I was across the table, holding the wineglass with one hand and breathing with the other. Time split in two in that instant. She laughed, he smiled, and I fell apart inside. But I remained motionless, like a crooked painting that no one notices, but insists on falling. I waited for dessert. I waited for the last drop. And when she turned to say something trivial, about the background music or the wine being full-bodied, I simply stood up, left the ring on the table, and left. There was no argument. No accusations. Silence was my sentence, and the sound of silverware continued as if nothing had happened. But it was all over there. The next morning, she showed up at home with red eyes and a rehearsed speech, a mixture of guilt, nervousness, and the cowardice typical of someone who fears discovery more than hurt. She tried using words like mistake, moment, confusion, as if betrayal were a stumble rather than a repeated choice. I heard every word, but didn't respond. Because, in that moment, she wasn't asking for my forgiveness, she was begging me to forget what I already knew. She wanted me to swallow the image of her leaning toward the other as if it were her own. She wanted me to erase the memory of my own heart breaking silently. There weren't enough tears to cleanse what I saw, nor any justification to mend the tear she herself had made. In the days that followed, she tried everything. Notes. Messages. Memories. She even used that soft tone of voice she used when she wanted forgiveness for forgetting a special date. But this wasn't forgetfulness. It was abandonment. Betrayal. Cowardice. And even though her world was slowly crumbling, even though I saw the weight of regret in her eyes, something inside me had already died. And when a part of love dies, the rest slowly sickens, until only emptiness remains. She came to me days later to say that her boss didn't want to continue. That, after dinner, he'd disappeared. That she'd understood, then, that she'd been just another distraction in his routine. A disposable fantasy. A pastime. She said this with tears in her eyes, but I could see, what hurt her wasn't the loss of him, but the fact that she'd been replaced before she could. She wasn't crying over the loss of love, she was crying over rejection. She wanted to understand how someone could simply turn away after so much dedication. And I, there in front of her, was the living embodiment of that answer. A few weeks later, she tried to get closer. She texted me saying she still loved me, that she hadn't stopped loving me at any point. That it was all a slip-up, an impulse, a need to feel desired again. As if I'd never looked at her with love. As if I hadn't held her pain on the nights she'd broken down, hadn't made plans, arranged surprises, bought her flowers for no reason, listened to her silences, and forgiven her insecurities one by one. She used love as an excuse to justify her selfishness. And worse, she wanted to use my love as a bridge to forget her own guilt. But time, oh, time, has a cruel way of teaching. While she was trying to pick up the pieces, I met someone. Someone whose eyes didn't hunger for approval. Someone who smiled with their eyes and respected with their gestures. Someone who understood that affection isn't currency, and that fidelity isn't a favor, it's a foundation. And, for the first time in a long time, I breathed a sigh of relief. Not because I was with someone else, but because I was free from the burden of someone who betrayed me. Because sometimes the greatest freedom is to free yourself from doubt. It's to stop wondering where you went wrong, when, why, and to understand that the mistake was never yours, but the choice of those who didn't choose you. The curious thing is that true love doesn't make a sound when it leaves. It just goes. And the only ones who lose it are those who didn't know how to care. She sought me out again months later. She was thinner, quieter, more lost. She was no longer the self-assured woman who bent her neck in public, certain that nothing would be discovered. She was a woman who seemed to have lived 20 years in two. She said she saw me in everything. That she tried to sleep, but her eyes wouldn't close. That she heard my laughter in empty places, that she touched old clothes, trying to remember my scent. And that, above all, she had finally understood what she had lost. And that was when I knew I had won. Because the forgiveness she sought was no longer necessary. I had already forgiven. But forgiveness is not an invitation back. It was just the most elegant way to say goodbye. She wanted to know if I still thought about her. And I considered lying, saying yes, that sometimes the memory came like a breeze. But I was honest. I said yes, I did. But not with longing, with lucidity. Because memory no longer hurts, it only reminds me of what I don't want to repeat. She looked into my eyes and realized the door was closed, not out of anger, but out of self-love. And that hurt more than any scream I could have let out. Time passed. I moved on. I built. I relearned how to truly smile. How to trust. How to love without fear. She moved on too, but carrying ghosts. And perhaps this is the greatest punishment of all, knowing she had everything, and lost it. That she was loved deeply, and threw it away. And that, in the end, the only embrace she still dreams of returning to, now welcomes another love. But what she doesn't know, what no one knows, is that that night at dinner, long before I got up from the table, something even crueler happened. Something she never imagined. Something that would change everything. And that's why this story needs to be told to its end. Because what seemed like mere betrayal hid much more than a flirtation or a scent. It hid silent truths, choices made in the dark, and a twist that not even time will be able to erase. Welcome to the channel. Here, betrayal is not glamorized, nor romanticized, is exposed for what it really is, a selfish choice that destroys homes, trust and entire futures. The stories you will hear are fictional, but the feelings, losses, and lessons are deeply real. Our goal is clear, to show that whoever cheats always loses, even if it takes time. Get ready. What you're about to hear is shocking, intense and unforgettable. Let the story begin. She was the kind of woman who seemed to have been born with a natural light, a glow that didn't ask permission to be present in any place. When she walked into a room, people noticed, but not just because of her appearance, there was something more, a mix of confidence and kindness in the way she smiled, as if she carried within her the calm of someone who had lived long enough to know that everything passes, even the most painful. She had a firm gaze, of someone who knew where she wanted to go, but who still allowed herself to dream of simple things, a dinner prepared together, an unexpected trip on any given weekend, laughter that began for no reason and ended in long hugs on the living room sofa. Her name was Emma, and she wasn't perfect, but she made it seem like being imperfect was part of her charm. He, on the other hand, was silent. He was the kind of man who spoke little and observed a lot. Not out of insecurity, but by choice. He always said the world spoke too loudly and that the true value of things lay in what was left unsaid. He had a discreet sense of humor, the kind that escapes in sideways smiles, in well-timed comments. He worked with numbers, spreadsheets, logic, but his heart was chaotic with emotions. His name was Ethan, and his greatest quality, and perhaps his greatest curse, was loving intensely. Loving with abandon. Loving with the belief that true love is still possible in a distracted world. When they met, it wasn't one of those epic movie encounters. It was simple, almost banal. She arrived late to an emotional management workshop organized by a mutual friend and sat in the only open chair, next to him. During the workshop, she talked more than she should have, laughed out loud during serious moments, and apologized afterward with a genuine smile. He simply replied that he liked people who laughed like her, unashamed of being happy. After that came the coffees, the long audio messages exchanged, the silent walks holding hands as if touch meant more than any conversation. The connection wasn't quick, it was slow, mature, built with small details, with attention and reciprocity. It was as if, finally, two worlds had found the connection they'd long sought. Emma had recently come out of a long-running relationship, full of control and guilt disguised as care. She carried trauma, insecurities, and a desire to prove she could still be loved without having to be someone else. Ethan, on the other hand, came from a more stable life, but marked by silent losses, a mother who died too soon, a brother estranged by unresolved conflicts, friendships that dissolved over time. When they decided to live together, it wasn't impulsive. They talked for months, aligned expectations, shared fears. They rented a small apartment with wide windows and a balcony with just enough room for a two-seater table. And it was enough. In the early years, they lived intensely and respectfully. They had their conflicts, like any couple, but they knew how to communicate. She liked to leave notes around the house with sweet or funny phrases. He made breakfast on his days off, always adding more sugar to hers, even when he complained. They made plans. They talked about children, even when they weren't in a rush. About where they would be at 50. About what they wanted to remember when they were old. They had codes, nicknames, songs that became the soundtrack to their little memories. They were, in everyone's eyes, the right couple. Not the perfect couple, but the right couple, the one that inspires security even when things get out of control. Over time, Emma's professional growth began. She began to be noticed at the company, promoted, invited to larger meetings, corporate events, and trips. Ethan was proud, supportive, and celebrated her every achievement sincerely. He was never one to be bothered by the success of the woman he loved. Quite the opposite. But little by little, something delicate began to change. There were no arguments. There was no disrespect. Just a subtle distancing, like someone slowly closing doors, one by one, without making a sound. Emma began arriving later. She responded with less enthusiasm. She smiled differently. When he asked if everything was okay, she said it was just fatigue, the weight of her responsibilities. He believed her, because those who love want to believe. Ethan was busy too. He worked too much, immersed in numbers and deadlines. But he always made a point of being there. Waiting for her with a glass of wine and a movie on pause. Listening to her, even when she didn't want to talk. Keeping the flame alive, even when the wind seemed to want to extinguish it. He tried to understand. He told himself it was just a phase. That things would soon return to normal. That every couple goes through ups and downs. But deep down, he felt her absence even when she was present. Friends noticed the change, but no one wanted to intervene. Some said it was routine. Others said that overwork wears down any relationship. Ethan kept his smile, but his eyes already held doubts. There were nights when he woke up and realized Emma wasn't by his side. He said he had insomnia. That he went for a drink of water. That he needed to answer an email. And he accepted it. Not out of naivete, but out of fear of facing what he already suspected. Because there are pains we prefer to postpone, even knowing they will come. Still, he persisted. He kept planning little surprises. A dinner out, a weekend in some quiet town, a gift left on her car seat with a handwritten note. He wanted to rekindle what seemed to have grown cold. Emma thanked him, smiled, but with a different sparkle in her eyes. Like someone who receives something beautiful but no longer knows what to do with it. Like someone who, little by little, forgets the value of what they hold in their hands. The apartment was losing color. Conversations became practical, functional. Good morning came without a kiss. Good night without a hug. Ethan started going out more, to clear his head. He'd come back late, but never drunk. Just tired of trying. Emma, on the other hand, seemed increasingly enveloped in a world he could no longer access. A world made of smiles for others, of secrets kept in the pocket of his blazer, of laughter that no longer belonged to him. Still, there were good days. Moments when she would lay her head on his chest and tell him everything was okay. That he was her safe haven. That she loved the way he looked at her. And he, foolish or hopeful, believed her. Because for those who truly love, a crumb of affection still feels like a feast. And it was in this scenario of silence, disconnection, and faded hope that the story unfolded. One day after another, like calm waves before the storm. Until the invitation came, the company couple's dinner. Formal. Elegant. A chance to be with her in her world. Ethan dressed carefully. She chose the tie she had given him months before. He looked in the mirror and wondered if she still saw him that way. And decided that, if not, he would at least try to remember who he was, the man who loved without reservation, who believed in love as something worthy, loyal, and whole. That night, under soft lights, clinking glasses, and calculated smiles, Ethan's world began to change forever. But he didn't know it yet. There was still hope in his eyes. There was still enough love to try one more time. There was still faith. And that's what makes it all the more cruel. Because sometimes, the greatest tragedy isn't when something ends, but when it ends within you, and the other person doesn't even realize it. And there, surrounded by strangers, forced smiles, and touches that no longer meant anything, the last flame was about to die out. And what would come after that night, would change everything forever. Dinner began with silverware gleaming in the soft light of the chandeliers, polite conversations passing between the tables, and measured laughter echoing between toasts and formal speeches. He felt somewhat out of place in that environment of rehearsed compliments and corporate masks, but he had learned to adapt, especially for her. Emma was beautiful that night, wearing a dress he couldn't remember ever seeing before, and there was something about her perfume that seemed different, not the scent, but the way she wore it, as if it weren't meant for him. He sat beside her, listening to her comments about her colleagues, upcoming projects, and the new positions being competed for. Ethan smiled quietly, listening with restrained affection, but something inside him stirred strangely. It was an almost imperceptible intuition, a subtle uneasiness that crept into his chest as if anticipating what was to come. The couples took turns talking about vacations, children, investments, travel destinations. Emma seemed engaged, smiling more than usual, gesturing lively, but she didn't look at him with the same light as before. Ethan watched, as he always did. He noticed the way she looked at her boss when he spoke, the slight tilt of her body toward him, the tone of her voice that gently, almost imperceptibly, thinned when the topic turned to him. At first, he tried not to read too much into it. He attributed it all to the natural enthusiasm of being among colleagues, to her desire to stand out, to be recognized. But something in that look, that specific glow, was unsettling in a different way. It wasn't admiration, nor was it respect. It was something else. It was a desire disguised as attention. It was an intimate trust, as if there were a shared territory between them to which he, her partner, had no access. Ethan drank sparingly that night. He wanted clarity. He felt any extra sip could make him vulnerable to an unnecessary outburst. He was more attentive than ever. Every gesture Emma made, every pause, every muffled laugh, every word. Until it happened. An exchange of glances, a comment that made his boss laugh, and then she lifted her neck. She offered her own neck so he could smell her perfume, as if it were completely natural, almost instinctive. The gesture was quick, but enough to shatter something inside Ethan. It was like witnessing an intimate scene that shouldn't exist, much less in front of other people, much less in front of him. The silence inside him turned to noise. The hand holding the napkin trembled slightly. Emma sat back down normally, as if nothing had happened. But it had. And in that second, he knew. Not because of the gesture itself, but because of the kind of freedom it carried. The freedom of someone who had already crossed boundaries. The freedom of someone who had already touched the forbidden, and returned. He didn't react immediately. He remained seated, listening to the conversations that now seemed distant, blurred, irrelevant. The world around him continued to function, but inside him, everything had stopped. She turned to him and said something about the wine, or perhaps the dessert, but he couldn't quite register it. He nodded and forced a smile, but it was as if his face no longer obeyed him. It was as if he were wearing his own skin for the last time. He waited for the right moment. He waited for the dinner to draw to a close, for the toasts to be repeated and the goodbyes to begin. When he stood, he didn't look at anyone. He left his ring on the table in a calculated gesture and left. The air outside was cold and sharp, but it offered something he lacked inside, honesty. Emma arrived home hours later. She was pale, distressed, her eyes red and her makeup smeared. She didn't need to say anything. He was on the couch, motionless, staring at the floor. When she asked why he'd left like that, he simply replied that he saw everything. She tried to argue, tried to downplay it, saying it was a silly gesture, an ill-timed joke, a misinterpretation. Ethan stood up, his body so weary he seemed to have aged 20 years in one night. He said the problem wasn't the gesture, but what it revealed. He said only those who have lost their modesty offer their necks. That only those who have forgotten their limits laugh like that. In the days that followed, she persisted. He texted, called, tried to explain himself. But he was already on a different wavelength. He hadn't yet decided what he would do, but he knew what they had was no longer what it once was. The house now felt cold. The memories stuck to the walls no longer brought comfort. Her once sweet notes seemed to echo ironies. Ethan didn't know where the disappointment began and the hurt ended. I only knew he was hurt in a way he didn't know how to heal. What hurt him wasn't just the betrayal, but the knowledge that, for so long, he was the only one still fighting for something that was already broken. Emma changed her tone over time. He stopped trying to justify it and started admitting it. He said he felt invisible, that work gave him a kind of adrenaline rush he no longer felt at home. That he missed being admired, being desired, feeling alive. Ethan listened silently. Because, as painful as the words were, they offered a kind of clarity he hadn't had before. And now that he could see, he could no longer unsee. The silence between them grew. Meals began to take place at different times. Their eyes stopped meeting. Her clothes piled up in closed suitcases, still without a destination. He started going out more. Not out of anger, but for survival. He needed to breathe outside of it all. He found comfort in simple places, a downtown coffee shop, a park bench, short conversations with non-judgmental strangers. For the first time, he began to imagine a life where she was no longer present. And that idea, though still painful, began to seem possible. One night, returning home, he found the lights off. The silence was absolute. On the table, an envelope. Inside, a handwritten letter. Emma said she needed some time, that she would be away for a few days. She said she didn't expect forgiveness, but that she wanted to explain everything when she was ready. He folded the letter carefully and put it in the dresser drawer, along with other memories that no longer hurt as much. He didn't cry. He didn't despair. He just sighed deeply, like someone who understands that love, sometimes, is just another train station, not a final destination. The days passed, and with them, the pain gave way to acceptance. Ethan began to reconnect with himself, to resume old habits, to listen to the songs that once hurt. And it was during this time that he met someone. An unpretentious encounter in a bookstore, a light conversation, shy laughter that grew over time. It was different. There was no rush, no need. Just two paths that crossed respectfully. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt peace. Not that confused euphoria, but the tranquility of knowing he could love again, in a different way, at a different pace, with different certainties. It was at that moment, as she was finally beginning to piece together her own story, that Emma returned. Not physically, but in a different form. With longer messages, a more resigned tone, with words that finally seemed to come from a place of sincerity. She said she wanted to tell him the truth. The whole truth. That there was something he needed to know, something she had kept hidden from the beginning, and that now, out of respect for what they had experienced, she needed to tell him. And then, just as he thought he had closed that chapter, a new page opened before him. And what was about to be revealed, was so much more than he could have imagined. Emma returned late on a rainy afternoon, her eyes filled with the shadow of months spent away. He didn't ask permission to enter. He simply turned the key he never returned and walked through the door as if he knew he was about to face the last chance he had left. The room was silent. Ethan was there, sitting on the same sofa where she'd left him last time, with the same posture, the same silent gaze, but with a different air, as if, finally, he'd accepted that certain losses aren't disasters, they're deliverances. She sat across from him, without touching him, without even getting too close. The distance between them seemed physical, yes, but it was much more than that. It was the abyss of everything left unsaid, the weight of gestures that hurt more than any words. Emma began slowly. Her voice trembled as if each word were a choice of courage. She said she'd spent the last few months trying to understand what had brought her to that point, trying to justify what she couldn't even forgive. She said she wished everything had been different, but that now, however futile regret might be, she needed to tell what she'd never had the courage to say. Ethan looked at her without interrupting. He simply listened, his arms crossed and his heart pounding. There was no longer any anticipation. Just the disconcerting calm of someone who's learned to survive the truth. She took a deep breath before continuing. She said that all of it, the flirting, the dinner, the involvement with her boss, hadn't started out of nowhere. That, in a way, she had been led, yes, but that deep down she knew she wasn't innocent. She confessed that there had been hidden encounters, that it wasn't a one-off mistake, but a sequence of poor choices, all cloaked in denial. But that wasn't what she had come back to say. Ethan, until that moment, hadn't reacted. He hadn't cried. He hadn't screamed. He hadn't asked questions. Because that, all of it, he had already figured out on his own. He had already pieced together the pieces of the puzzle and fitted each pane into its rightful place. But it was when she stopped for a second, lowered her eyes, and began to cry softly, that he knew, there was more. Something still hidden. Something that went beyond betrayal. Emma looked up, and with a broken voice, said she needed to tell the truth about what happened next. About what came when her boss left. About what she discovered alone, in silence. And then she told him. She said that, weeks after dinner, she tried to reconnect with him. That she persisted in texting, emailing, calling. But he never responded. She didn't understand. Until one day, out of curiosity or desperation, she searched social media for any sign of him. That was when she saw it. He was with another woman. A woman she knew. A woman she had coincidentally crossed paths with at a party years before. She was Ethan's ex-girlfriend. The only ex with whom he still maintained discreet, respectful contact. The one he never held a grudge against. Emma said she didn't understand at first. But the more she investigated, the clearer it became, they were together, and there was a real chance that all of it, the flirting, the interest, the supposed infatuation, had been part of a plan. Ethan finally moved. He frowned, uncomprehending. And she continued. She said that, days after discovering their connection, she received an anonymous email. No subject line. Just an attachment. In it, there were screenshots of conversations. Conversations between the boss and Ethan's ex-conversations about how they would show her what it's like to lose, and about giving her a taste of her own medicine. Emma said that, at first, she thought it was fake. That it was some kind of trick her own mind had set to justify the rejection. But then, days later, the boss himself confirmed it. Without guilt, without remorse. He said he was bored, that she was just a diversion. That the idea had come from Ethan's ex, who wanted revenge. That he knew Emma was insecure, that she needed attention, that she would be easy to manipulate. Ethan clenched his fists but remained silent. Not out of indifference, but because his mind began connecting the dots with brutal speed. He remembered old conversations with his ex, the way they'd ended, the words that had lingered. He remembered how Emma had always feared that woman, though she'd never had a reason to. And now, before him, everything fell into place. The betrayal was real, yes. But there was something even crueler: she'd been used. And, more than that, so had he. Emma kept talking. She said she couldn't sleep for weeks. That her boss's disdain had destroyed her more than Ethan's judgment. That realizing she'd been a pawn in two people's game was a pain she couldn't describe. But the worst part, she said, wasn't that. The worst part was discovering, too late, that she still loved Ethan. That she always had. And that, by giving in to vanity, neediness, and pride, she'd destroyed the only place where she'd been truly loved. Ethan listened to her with his eyes fixed. He felt anger, yes. Not at the betrayal, which was already in the past, but at the cruel irony of fate. Seeing that, in the end, everyone lost. That he was betrayed by the one he trusted most, and also deceived by someone who once swore to love him. That Emma was dragged into a game of revenge disguised as passion. And that, at the center of it all, he was, trying to love calmly, trying to build something solid, while everyone around him wallowed in their own insecurities. She said she hadn't come to apologize. That she knew it was too late. But she needed him to know. That her guilt was real, but so was what they did to her. That she deserved to bear the weight of the betrayal, yes, but that there was something inhumane about being led there so coldly. Ethan finally stood. He walked to the window. He took a deep breath. And for the first time, he spoke. He said he didn't know what hurt more, being betrayed by her, or being included, even indirectly, in a petty revenge plot. He said that for a long time, he wondered where he went wrong. But now he understood, he never was. He just believed too much. He trusted too much. He loved too much. Emma stood up, in tears. She said she was leaving. She just wanted him to know the truth. Ethan turned and, in a calm tone, said she'd done what she felt she needed to do. That forgiveness would come, one day. But that love, that was already gone. And that, now, he wouldn't look back. She left. And the silence returned. But this time, it wasn't a silence of pain. It was the kind of silence that precedes rebuilding. Because sometimes the only way to start over is to know exactly where it all ended. And for Ethan, that ending was now clear. Painful. But clear. And finally, definitive. Emma didn't return that night, nor the next morning. The messages stopped, the silence took on new layers, but this time, there was something different about that absence. It was no longer unsettling, no longer painful. It was, in a way, expected. Ethan continued his routine without much deviation. Work continued, household chores flowed with almost mechanical precision, the days passed in a calm that had previously seemed unattainable. Emma's revelation hadn't brought relief, but it had brought clarity. And with clarity came a new kind of peace, not the kind found in the absence of pain, but the kind achieved after surviving it. Days later, he saw her again. Not by choice, but by chance. He was in a small market, one of those neighborhood ones he often stopped at to buy specific items, and when he turned into the dairy aisle, he came face to face with her, standing in front of the cheese shelf, as if frozen there for seconds. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, no one said anything. There was no room for scandal, no room for drama. Just two faces who knew each other deeply, recognizing, there, the ruins of what had once been. She was holding a juice box, but it seemed she no longer knew why she was holding it. He simply nodded slightly, as if to say, "It's okay," and continued on his way. She didn't follow him, didn't try anything. She respected the gesture. She respected the silence. She respected, perhaps for the first time, the fact that there was nothing left to rebuild. Ethan returned home with a strangely light heart. Not because he had found Emma again, but because he realized how far he had come since everything began to fall apart. That woman there was no longer the woman he loved, and he was no longer the man who tried to save her from herself. They had both transformed. They had both aged emotionally in a brutal and definitive way. That exchange of glances at the market was, without a doubt, the final chapter of a book whose cover was already closed. That night, sitting on the porch with a book open on his lap and a cup of tea slowly cooling in his hand, Ethan thought about how life has a strange way of pushing us to places we never imagined. He thought about how, if he had known it all earlier, he might have freaked out. Maybe I would have screamed, broken things, cried until I dehydrated. But now, it was as if everything had fallen into place with cold, mathematical logic. There was no longer any need to understand the whys. He already knew enough. He had seen emotional rock bottom and discovered that, even at the bottom, there was a ladder waiting for him, a ladder built with self-respect, with boundaries, with the harsh acceptance that love, sometimes, isn't enough to stop someone from hurting you. Shortly thereafter, a new scenario began to unfold in his life. It wasn't a sweeping romance, nor a sudden infatuation. It was something shy, gradual, like a warm breeze at the end of a cold afternoon. He met Laura at a cafe where he often wrote in his notebook. She was sitting at the next table, discussing a book with a friend, and the way she spoke, firmly but sweetly, captured his attention. The conversation turned to smiles, the smile turned to exchanged glances, and within a few meetings, Ethan realized that Laura was in no rush. She didn't intrude, didn't demand, didn't insinuate. She simply existed, with a light presence and an honest demeanor. For the first time in a long time, he felt he didn't need to hide his scars. And she didn't treat them as flaws, but as parts of her story. As the months passed, his bond with Laura grew stronger. There was mutual respect, long conversations, spontaneous laughter, and, above all, a serene calm, the kind that only exists when you're no longer walking on broken pieces. Laura recognized his silences and didn't try to fill them. She simply accompanied them. And that, for Ethan, was everything. He began to see himself, little by little, opening up inner spaces he'd previously kept locked away. He began to talk about his fears, about the feeling of being betrayed not only physically, but in the purest trust. He spoke about Emma, not with anger, but with a mature sincerity that Laura knew how to listen to without interrupting, without judging, without competing. One night, as they walked together down a quiet street, Laura held his hand tighter and told him she admired his courage. That it wasn't easy to love after being hurt, much less to allow yourself to be loved again. Ethan smiled, that small smile he saved for moments of truth. And I knew, then and there, that he was ready to truly start over. But the universe, always willing to test certainties, made a point of throwing one last piece onto the board. Months after their reunion at the market, an unexpected message arrived. It was from an old mutual friend, who hadn't spoken to Ethan since the days when he and Emma were the group's inseparable couple. The message was short, almost devoid of context. It simply said, "Did you see this?" and attached a video link. Ethan hesitated before clicking, but curiosity got the better of him. The video was from a recently published podcast. Emma was the guest. At first, it seemed like just a normal interview. She talked about her career, social projects, life changes. But in the final minutes, the tone changed. The host asked a direct, unexpected question: "Have you ever regretted a life-changing choice?" She fell silent. Swallowed hard. And then began to speak. She said yes. That the biggest wrong choice of her life was failing to care for the one who truly loved her. She said she had betrayed a man who treated her like no one else had. That she allowed her vanity and insecurity to destroy what was most pure in her. She said she had been deceived afterward, used, ridiculed. But looking back, she didn't feel like a victim. She felt responsible. Because betrayal isn't just about the act, it's about ignoring the signs, choosing one's own ego, hiding behind lame excuses. And that, if she could go back, she would have held that hug longer. She would have said, "Thank you," more often. She would have loved better. She would have truly loved. Ethan closed the video before it finished. Not out of anger, but because he already knew what was coming next. That public confession didn't change the past. It didn't rebuild bridges. But it served as a distant echo of what once was, and was now nothing more than a memory. He pocketed his phone, took a deep breath, and started walking again. Laura was waiting for him at the cafe. He wasn't late. Deep down, Emma was right. The choices we make define not only what we will have, but what we will forever lose. Ethan chose to move on. And now, he carried not the weight of betrayal, but the silent pride of someone who survived it and was still able to love again. Because, in the end, that's what truly matters, not what they did to you, but what you chose to do with it. And he chose to live. The morning after the video, Ethan woke earlier than usual, as if his body had been summoned by something his mind hadn't yet fully grasped. There was no rush, no distress, just that quiet restlessness that arises when you sense a cycle, even if it's already practically over, is about to close for good. He made his coffee in silence, watching the window fogged with condensation and listening to the muffled sound of the city waking up. The steaming cup in his hands felt like an anchor, and for a moment he remained still, trapped in time, contemplating everything he had experienced up until that point. Emma's public confession didn't change the facts, didn't erase the wounds, but it added unexpected moral weight to the narrative he had been so laboriously maintaining. For the first time, he found himself faced with a dilemma that was not only emotional, but ethical: what to do with the sincere repentance of someone who had caused him so much. And even more so, how to move forward with a clean heart, knowing that she now bore the shame of her wrong choice before everyone. It wasn't about forgiveness anymore. He had already granted himself and her that long ago. The dilemma was deeper, more human. To what extent are we responsible for healing those who have hurt us? To what extent should we repay with empathy what was denied us in our most vulnerable hour? Ethan didn't have the answers, and perhaps never would, but he knew he couldn't simply ignore the weight of what he saw and heard. Even though her voice no longer echoed in his feelings, it still reverberated in his consciousness. He knew Emma was experiencing the harshest consequence of her actions, the emptiness of looking back and seeing, with cruel clarity, the exact moment she destroyed what she loved most. And that, in itself, was a kind of punishment that no words could alleviate. Over the next few days, he tried to distract himself, but that persistent feeling of an unfinished cycle stayed with him. Laura noticed. Not as jealousy or distrust, but as a sincere intuition of someone who knows the other deeply. One calm evening, as they shared a glass of wine under the warm lights of the balcony, she looked at him calmly and asked if there was anything unresolved between him and Emma. The question, though predictable, fell with the weight of a judgment. Ethan hesitated. He looked into Laura's eyes, felt the honesty in her gesture, and responded with the same transparency. He said there was no love, no desire, no longing, but there was empathy. And that, even though everything was overcome, there was a part of him that needed to understand until the end. Laura didn't look away, didn't defend herself, didn't withdraw. She simply nodded with a brief, sincere smile and said that trust is also allowing the other person to close the doors of the past with their own hands. Ethan felt a relief he hadn't known in a long time. Not by permission, but by the mutual understanding that moving forward sometimes requires one last look back. At the end of that same week, he decided to write a letter. Not with the intention of rekindling things, nor of opening a new channel of communication, but as a final gesture of maturity. He needed to express what he was carrying inside, not so that Emma would know, but so that he himself would stop carrying it. He spent hours choosing each word with almost surgical precision, avoiding dramatization or accusations. He said he understood her fragility, that he accepted her regret, and that he saw courage in her public exposure. He said he didn't want suffering or resentment, and that he hoped, from the bottom of his heart, that she would be able to rebuild herself with dignity. But he also made it clear that that chapter was closed, that he had found peace again, and that he now walked alongside someone who taught him every day that love doesn't have to hurt to be true. He ended with a short but definitive sentence: "You were an important part of my story, but you will not be part of my destiny." He carefully folded the paper, placed it in an envelope, and left it at the entrance of her building, unsigned and unsigned. He didn't expect a reply. And he didn't receive it. The week that followed was strangely light. The weight he'd been carrying seemed to have been lifted completely. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt there was nothing hanging between him and the past. The path was finally clear. And it was in this new state of mind that he began to build a deeper life with Laura. They traveled, explored different places, exchanged childhood stories, future plans, and shared comfortable silences that required no explanation. With her, Ethan discovered the simplicity of being with someone who doesn't create emotional labyrinths, who doesn't test, who doesn't demand dramatization as proof of love. The lightness of that relationship was a breath of maturity in his weary soul. And, more than any romantic gesture, what moved him most was the way she respected his space without trying to force it. Meanwhile, Emma retreated into herself. Her exposure on the podcast generated mixed reactions. Some applauded her for her courage, others judged her for her betrayal, but most simply remained silent. Realizing that the world doesn't revolve around our suffering is one of the hardest lessons of adulthood. And that's what she began to understand. Her days became more introspective. She avoided social media, declined invitations, and re-evaluated decisions. She began therapy, wrote letters she never sent, and reread old books in search of pieces of herself she couldn't remember where she'd lost them. She didn't expect to win Ethan back. She knew that time had passed. But there was something deeper at play. She needed to learn to live with the echo of her own choices. A few months passed. Ethan and Emma's reunion happened unexpectedly, once again. It was at a contemporary art exhibition organized by a local NGO. They were both invited by different friends and arrived at different times. When they saw each other, it was like seeing a memory materialized in the present. She was different, more sober, more restrained, with the air of someone who had learned not to rush. He greeted her with a slight wave, and she returned it with a small but sincere smile. There was no conversation, no closeness, but in that look, there was a silent understanding. The kind of understanding that requires no words because it has already been expressed in every tear, in every absence, in every choice made since then. Ethan didn't say anything to Laura that night. Not by omission, but because there was nothing to tell. The past was now just that, past. And his heart was firmly in the present. The moral dilemma that had previously troubled him no longer existed. He had done what he could, said what needed to be said, and now all that was left was to live what was to come. For the first time, he no longer felt like the victim of a poorly told story, but rather the author of a new chapter where, finally, he was the protagonist of his own life. Over time, Emma distanced herself even further from the networks, the memories, and the people who connected her to what she experienced with Ethan. She moved house, began visiting new places, and made friends with people who didn't know her previous self. She began rebuilding a version of herself that wasn't tied to mistakes, but to learning. And even carrying the weight of what she lost, she found a way to move on. Because pain, when well processed, becomes maturity. And maturity, even if it comes late, is the only possible path for those who wish to start over with dignity. Ethan, now fully involved in a new love, began to consider previously dormant possibilities. He talked to Laura about living together, about creating something solid, true, without ghosts lurking in the corners of the house. Laura accepted with the same calm she had always shown him. Together, they chose a new apartment, planted a small vegetable garden on the balcony, and began to live their days with a lightness that, in the past, had seemed unattainable. He hadn't forgotten what he'd experienced with Emma, but it no longer hurt. It was like a well-healed scar, visible, yes, but one that didn't impede any movement, any embrace, any new beginning. And now, as the one-year anniversary of that company dinner approached, the silent milestone of everything that followed, Ethan sat at his new desk, in his new home, beside the woman who now walked with him. He opened his laptop, reread some old texts he'd written in his darkest moments, and smiled. He smiled because he survived. Because you healed. Because, despite everything, I still believed in love. Not the idealized, naive love, but real love, the kind that arises when two people decide not to hurt each other. And without needing to say it out loud, he knew, deep down, that the story was ready to end. But before that, something still needed to happen. Something that would provide the final outcome, that would definitively conclude the cycle. And it was about to happen. It was early autumn when chance decided to bring the three of them together in the same place for the first time. It wasn't planned, it wasn't expected, but there was a strange precision to the moment, as if time had rehearsed that final intersection. It was a Saturday morning, the air was beginning to lose its summer warmth, and the city was enveloped in a soft light that made everything slower, more observant. Ethan and Laura had been invited to a cultural benefit at a newly opened community center, a simple event focused on fundraising and showcasing local artists, a cause they both admired. Emma was there too. Not as an active participant, but as a discreet collaborator, curating a small exhibition room on emotional memories and reconciliation with the past. It was a recent volunteer effort, part of her personal process of rebuilding. Ethan noticed her first. Not because of her obvious presence, but because of the detail in the paintings, which featured quotes about choices, photographs blurred by time, and small, anonymous handwritten notes recounting decisions that changed everything. It was a sensitive, beautiful concept, and it immediately captured his attention. Laura, beside him, commented on the delicacy of the works, smiling with that calmness so characteristic of her, but she noticed his gaze harden slightly. There was no need to ask, she understood. Emma was there, and the air, light as it was, felt heavy for a few seconds. Emma saw them later. And for a moment, she froze. I didn't know if I should leave the room, pretend I hadn't noticed, or face whatever the moment demanded. But there was no escape. Because what had once been a hurricane of emotions was now a low tide. It hurt, yes, but bearably, and part of her understood that perhaps this was the final moment they never had, the one that didn't come with screams, letters, or videos, but with a calm presence and eyes that no longer avoided each other. Ethan didn't move. He continued to stare at an installation of letters suspended in the air by invisible threads. He picked one up. The handwriting was feminine, trembling, as if written in tears. If I could go back, I wouldn't go back to change what I did, but to be someone who didn't have to. He stood there for a few seconds, reading and rereading, and only then did he notice Emma approaching. Laura, with the sensitivity he so admired, discreetly walked away, saying she was going to get something to drink. He left them both there, facing the past that now walked with calm steps. Emma didn't say hello, just stood beside him, looking at the same letter. She took a deep breath before speaking, her voice more restrained, more sober. She said it was one of the first messages received in the project, written by a woman who lost her husband after years of emotional neglect. Ethan listened, but remained silent for a moment, until he turned to her and asked, matter-of-factly, if that was her job now, to rescue stories that had hurt in silence. She nodded with a slight, almost ironic smile and replied yes, that she needed to believe it was possible to make sense of what had hurt, even if it couldn't be fixed. There was a time when any conversation between them required tension, explanations, long pauses to avoid saying what they wanted to shout. But now, the words came with maturity. Emma asked about Laura, gently, sincerely. Ethan replied that they were fine, building something real, with their feet on the ground and their hearts at peace. She smiled, and for the first time that smile wasn't bitter. It brought relief. Emma then said she didn't want to interrupt too much, but there was something she'd never been able to say, not when she'd told him the truth, nor when she'd received the letter he'd left. She said she'd only recently understood that the love he'd offered was rare, but that back then, she was someone who couldn't recognize what was true, she only responded to what shone brightest, even if it burned. She said she'd always sought to be desired, but never learned how to become someone worthy of staying. Ethan listened with quiet respect. He was no longer the wounded man trying to find logic in unthinkable gestures. He was someone whole, who finally understood that not every mistake is born of malice, some are born of a lack of self-knowledge, and that doesn't lessen the pain, but it makes it easier to move on. Before leaving, Emma handed him a small envelope. She told him there was no need to open it there, that it was merely a symbolic ending, something she needed to offer to finally free herself from what was left. He thanked her, put the envelope in his pocket, and for a second, their eyes met again, as they had in the past, but there was no longing. Only respect. And respect, sometimes, is the most that can remain between two who have loved each other. On the way out, Ethan ran into Laura again in the Spaces cafeteria, and before she could even ask him anything, he smiled and said he was fine. She gently took his hand and replied that she knew. Nothing more was needed. Back at the apartment, with the afternoon fading into night outside, Ethan sat at the table and opened the envelope. Inside was a single photo. It was of the two of them, taken in a park years ago, on an ordinary morning. Emma had written on the back, "Not everything that ends was a lie. But not everything that hurt had to happen." He read it, reread it, put the photo in a keepsake box, and placed it high on the dresser. Not to forget, but to remember from afar. Because now the love that mattered was the present. And the present didn't ask for explanations, didn't demand proof. It simply let itself live. Outside, night fell serenely, and the wind carried the scent of a new beginning. Ethan knew, with the calm of someone who has weathered a storm, that the end is sometimes just the beginning in disguise. And that, in the silence that remains after the final goodbye, lies the chance to finally write a story that doesn't need forgiveness to be whole. Time, with its relentless delicacy, took charge of putting each piece in its place. Life went on, as it always does, without asking permission, without giving clear warnings, simply flowing between the spaces that were once filled with pain. Ethan and Laura moved into a single-story house with wide windows and a kitchen open to the backyard. Mornings began to smell of fresh bread, late afternoons were accompanied by books spread out on the table and conversations about the future spoken in low tones, with the intimacy of someone who no longer needs to prove anything to be loved. It was a silent but complete love, like a song that needs no chorus to be unforgettable. Ethan felt he had finally built a home, not just a place to live, but a space where his soul rested, where traumas had been honored and healed, and where the past was no longer a shadow, but merely a memory that no longer screamed. Emma, on the other hand, faced the reality of her chosen path. After her final encounter with Ethan at that exhibition, she fully immersed herself in her journey of self-discovery. She cut ties with old friendships that kept her trapped in destructive cycles, ended contracts that drained her senseless, and began investing her time in projects of emotional reconstruction through art. It was her way of giving back to the world something she couldn't give to the love she lost. However, there were days when emptiness knocked on her door, and she couldn't ignore it. It was the kind of pain that doesn't ask for permission, it just arrives. I walked down streets where they once held hands, heard songs they once sang in the car on short trips, and all of it came like small, invisible punches. The difference now was that she no longer ran away. She sat with the pain, offered it tea, and told herself she was paying a fair price for not recognizing the value of what she had. The years passed. Ethan received an unexpected invitation to speak at a seminar on relationship ethics and personal growth. The event focused on emotional reconstruction after betrayal and loss. He hesitated, thinking it might not be his place to speak about it publicly, but Laura encouraged him with the gentle firmness she always knew how to use. She said that perhaps someone needed to hear his story so they wouldn't make the same mistakes. Ethan accepted. And it was on that stage, before dozens of attentive faces, that he recounted his journey, not as a lament, but as a testament to the fact that it is possible to survive the most intimate pain without letting it define who you will be later. When he finished, there was no euphoric applause, only silence. And in that silence, he felt something he had never felt before, completeness. After the talk, as he walked to the parking lot, a young woman approached him with tears in her eyes. She said she was about to cheat on her husband, that she was experiencing a suffocating lack, but that upon hearing his story, she realized she needed to seek help, not destruction. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He simply held her hands and said, "Every pain you avoid today, someone will feel in your place tomorrow. Be careful what you do with what you lack." She thanked him and left. So did he. But she took that moment as a symbolic seal that her pain had not been in vain. She had served to protect others from the same ruin. Emma, in turn, wrote a book. Not about the relationship itself, but about choices and losses. A fictional novel, but one laden with personal layers. It was published by a small publisher, without great pretensions, but the story began to gain traction among readers seeking to understand the boundaries between love and ego. During the book launch at a local bookstore, she answered a question many avoided: "Do you still blame yourself for what happened?" She took a deep breath and replied firmly, "No. Guilt paralyzes. I hold myself accountable. And this responsibility accompanies me every day. But it's what keeps me alert to never hurt anyone again the way I did." The audience fell silent. And in that silence, Emma understood that she had done what she could with the pieces that remained. She hadn't rebuilt what she lost, but she had built something else: integrity. Years later, Ethan and Emma's paths never crossed again. Not accidentally. Not by mistake. It was as if the universe, after so much noise, had finally understood that they were ready to move on without any issues, without any ghosts. Ethan married Laura in a low-key ceremony, surrounded by a few friends, with simple and sincere vows. There were no frills, no exaggerations. Just the truth. Emma heard the news through a mutual friend. He smiled when he heard it, but didn't cry. Not because he no longer felt anything, but because he now understood that loving someone can also mean letting them go in peace. One of those ordinary days, Ethan found in an old memory box the oldest note Emma had left him, written in the first months of their relationship. The handwriting was delicate, and the message read, "Thank you for teaching me that love can be light." He put the note back in the box, looked out the window where Laura was watering the plants, and felt a mixture of nostalgia and gratitude in his chest. Life had been generous, even with all the pain. And so, Ethan and Emma's story came to an end. An end that didn't come with reconciliation, but with growth. An end that demands not applause, but respect. Because sometimes, the greatest victory isn't in recovering what was lost, but in rebuilding something new from it. True love doesn't die, it simply changes address. And respect, when cultivated in the end, is the highest gesture of love one can offer to someone who was once everything. Comment below what you thought of this story. Which part touched you most? Which character did you understand most? We want to hear your opinion. And of course, if you enjoyed this narrative, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Here, real, impactful, and moving stories come to life to spark deep reflection. And let this story serve as a lesson: betrayal isn't just a mistake, it's a rupture that lasts far beyond the moment. It destroys not only relationships, but also the dignity, trust, and self-worth of the perpetrator. Rebuilding yourself after hurting someone is possible, but the price is high. And the person who forgives you won't always be there to see you change. May this teach us that love needs to be nurtured every day, with attention, honesty, and truth. And finally, remember, this channel never supports any kind of betrayal. Here, truth, respect, and love walk hand in hand. Until the next story.